And we are back. Our next guest is a distinguished leader, deeply engaged in faith-based community organizing, for justice. He has a rich background in advocating for social and environmental causes. His insights promise to shed light on the urgency of environmental justice in underserved communities and the imperative of equity in shaping our environmental discourse. Here now is the pastor of the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, Pastor William H. Lamar IV. And Pastor Lamar, thank you for being with us.
Daren, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, glad to have this conversation because I think when we talk about social justice, as I mentioned in a previous segment, that sometimes environmental justice doesn't always get the justice it deserves when it comes to social justice. How are you seeing environmental justice play out right now?
Well, Daren, you can't talk about justice itself without having a conversation that does not bifurcate, that does not separate any of the components that would make for a flourishing and an abundant life for all communities. Therefore, you can't talk about, you were talking earlier about prison industrial complex, you talk about education, we talk about the ravages of what the late James Lawson would call plantation capitalism. You have to frame all of these injustices within what I would call an environmental milieu, or within a discussion of the health of the planet Earth. Because if the planet is not healthy, then we are not healthy. If the planet is not thriving, then we cannot thrive. I remember one of my mentors said that the Earth indeed will replenish itself without us, but we ourselves cannot be replenished without the Earth. And if you think about the heat that we are experiencing, so I live in Washington, D.C., and live outside of Washington, work in the city. And on yesterday, when my wife and I got in the car, it was 115 degrees according to the car's thermometer. This type of sweltering heat affects and afflicts Black people, brown people, poor people, more so than any others. In tree-lined communities, in communities with reflective surfaces like light-colored roofs, light-colored paving, impervious surfaces where water is able to be collected and reused, it can be 20 degrees cooler. And what we've learned in the work that we're doing in environmental justice is that the indication of extreme hot days drives social crises. It drives crime. It drives health disparity. Literally, people are dying and being cooked in these hot places. And these places were designed to be hotter. I was reading through the biography of Robert Moses, who designed New York City largely, and really did it without a sense of justice, did it designing the city to keep Black people and poor people and brown people away from parks, away from swimming pools. When they designed these cities, they were clear that our communities would not get trees, would not get parks, would not get green space. This is written into the geography of our cities. And because public policy created it, not only by disinvesting, but I would argue by stealing tax dollars from Black, brown, and poor communities and using those dollars to make sure that wealthy communities were green, to make sure they were cooler. We have to repatriate those dollars. And it is best to help all of us by lifting up the beauty and cooling the communities where those who struggle most are gathered and where we live.
Unpack that a little bit more for us, because I think sometimes we don't have those conversations. And the Robert Moses conversation is a great one to know about the, not, you talk about environmental justice, but you have to talk about environmental discrimination. And that's where it first really begins, that there is this discrimination that pre-exists what we're seeing right now that plays out in so many areas. So when you find out why certain people aren't by parks or aren't by spaces that are profitable, or everyday spaces that we should be partaking in, there's a reason behind it.
Well, Daren, you raise an excellent point. So for those of you not familiar with the work by the great Robert Caro, The Power Broker, about Robert Moses, who created modern day New York City, who accumulated bureaucratic power, so much so that governors of the state of New York, mayors of the city of New York, presidents of the United States could not touch him because of the way that he insulated himself bureaucratically and legislatively. What he did was he built throughways, parkways, highways that demolished Black communities, that demolished white ethnic communities. And he created park spaces, green spaces. And you read the book, he was very clear that these communities would not benefit, that these were not the kinds of people he wanted to go to his parks, to go to public swimming pools. This is by design. I need us to understand when we go through Black, brown, poor communities, and they are hotter, understand that this is not the will of God, that this is not what the divine intends, that human beings created cities where we would be in the places that were hotter, where we would be near places that are chemically compromised, compromised by industrial waste. I mean, you can compare what Robert Moses did to keep Black people away from parks and green spaces and to aggregate us in colonies of poverty to what happens in my own native southeastern United States, where we have cancer alleys in multiple states throughout the South, where people have for years discarded of industrial waste near Black and brown communities. My wife is from one of those communities. Her family members have been ravaged by cancer. I have other family members from South Georgia ravaged by cancer. And so these things are not happenstance. And today, all of the drivers for inequity can be tied to the health of the earth and to the heat that people are experiencing. I mean, when we were out yesterday, Daren, the heat was wilting, and everybody was saying, I've never felt what I'm feeling now, and it will get hotter. I just read yesterday that James Inhofe died, a U.S. Senator, I think from Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. He was a climate denier. We are electing people who deny the reality of science, and not just science. I mean, my grandfather might say he didn't have any degrees in science, but I know what I feel. I know the earth. I know what I'm used to. I know what I can track. My body is not lying to me, and what we see is not lying to us.
So let me push this out a little bit further because, and incidentally, you know, Robert Moses has a parkway up here in New York. If you're going up to Niagara Falls, for those that don't know, if you ride on Niagara Falls, it's called the Robert Moses Parkway. But enough with Robert Moses. He's got enough credibility. I mean, I should say press for the day. But let me talk about this right here. When we talk about environmental action, calls to action, dealing with it. A little earlier, I was talking with the guest, Tucson, Arizona. We referenced Flint, Michigan, talked about what's going on there, how we really have to, you know, address this. It seems as though we're not getting as many people on the field to be to wave the flag to say there's something wrong. We are seeing a lot of people talk about climate change more than ever before. I was in a conversation with our former President Al Gore, and he said there's more people. He said, before I looked like I was the only guy, you know, and there's a few of us who are out there, and we look like the oddballs. He said, but it seems like there's more balls that are now becoming odd, and more people are joining on. How do you feel about his statement? Like, you know, have we gotten more people in the area of environmental justice? And two, I'll come back and talk a little bit about the church because that's where you're housed and that's where I'm familiar with. Talk to us about the church and also how we can be more engaged in this area.
Thanks, Daren. So let me start. I think that the former vice president, who should have been president of the United States if we really had a democracy, we can talk later about the fundamental, I would call, evil of the Electoral College, which takes and destroys the will of the majority in the nation. We talk about that later. But I think that Mr. Gore is correct, especially when we interface with younger people. So part of the work that got me to your wonderful platform to discuss this is we are funded by two philanthropies to help Black churches and Black organizations on the ground who are fighting for cooler climates in their environments. We're funding them to do projects to help communities flourish in New Orleans and San Antonio and other places But the young people with whom we interface, Howard University undergraduates and others that we work with, they see climate as an existential crisis, and they are correct. We were on Capitol Hill 2 days ago. One of the gentlemen with us is the chief of sustainability for the city of San Antonio, Texas. And he said there are places in San Antonio that get to between 125 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit, where people cannot go outside with children nor pets. That will interrupt the entire economy. That will interrupt how we live and order our lives. And we see young people who literally are going into mental health crises because they can see that I'll be 50 next month, that should they live to be 50, 70, 80, they will not be able to live the lives that they know now because it will be too hot for certain activity. And that will further plunge us into climate crises, because that means that we will more frequently amp up air conditioning. It's a feedback loop of death and despair, which can be corrected. So one of the things we're doing with the church, we're talking about smart surfaces. So Daren, you can cool communities 10, 12, 15 degrees by planting trees. We were talking at that same congressional hearing that you can be under a tree on a hot day and it's 18 to 20 degrees cooler. You try it yourself. We're talking about no more paving with dark, hot asphalt, which traps heat and then radiates heat all night long. Green roofs, planting trees on roofs, collecting water. Many of our neighborhoods are surrounded, pockmarked by parking lots and schools. Turn those parking lots into green spaces. Have it where cars can park on gravel. There are things that can be done, but what we're facing now, Daren, is this. The concrete lobby, very powerful. Other lobbies that work with cities and states and sell infrastructure to them do not want to see us to move in this direction because it hurts the bottom line. So always in America, the question is one of capitalism. The question is one of money. Will we be more concerned with profits or people? The problem is, if all of the people are too hot, all the people have died because the planet is dying, there will be no profits to be made. When will there be enough? There is a way for us to live together and care for one another. And one of the things that the mathematical and economic models say is over-investing in communities that have been robbed of this green infrastructure will help all of us become more healthy.
Pastor Lamar, I got to ask you a question, because when we talk about community, I mean, that's it right there. We know that we have to have a voice. And when it comes to Black and brown communities, sometimes the question is, or the allegation is, we don't focus on this issue of environmental justice, which brings to light, engagement. We can become politically engaged, and we're politically engaged on a lot of different things, but when it comes to environmental justice, we're bringing up the rear.
You know, what I would argue, Daren, is some can see it that way, but what I think it is, it's more to me a question and challenge of exposure and perspective. I can take you to groups in cities like Jacksonville, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, coastal cities, where there are scores of Black people on the front line doing this work, but they don't get media exposure. They're not talking to cable news. They're not talking to BronxNet. They're not being lifted up. The media often lifts up stories that continue the narratives that will help them maintain the world as it is. So one of the things I argue, and there's much scholarship out there, that Black criminality is a narrative that helps build wealth for non-Black people. So here's an example. If you keep saying that in this neighborhood, Black people are killing each other, Black people are killing each other, if you keep, as a newspaper and local news, telling that story, then what you do is you drive down property values. What happens then is speculators and vultures come in, buy up neighborhoods where Black people once lived, and now when you go back to the neighborhood you grew up in, you can't afford a blade of grass because it's been completely gentrified. And a part of that story was a narrative of black criminality that is no more true than any narrative of white criminality. What people will tell you is there is no such thing as black on black crime. That's a marketing myth. You don't hear about white on white crime when white people kill white people at a rate similar and sometimes more than black people kill black people, or the myth about black people being addicted to drugs. No more black people use drugs than white people. But these are myths that feed into systems of oligarchy, that feed into systems of kleptocracy. Black people have always been doing this work, but people are not telling the story. If people want to tell the story, I can connect you with the folks who will shatter these myths, and you will be able to find out exactly who's on the front lines making it happen.
Amazing. I know we do need to put that out there because I think so many times we have been misled, hoodwinked, bamboozled, run amok, led astray, right? You know, we've gotten that to the place that we don't think that there is activism that's out there. But talk to us about the church and how can the church can be more active and where the church is active in this area.
Let me say this. The Black church has also been a victim of these stories. The Black church has been a fugitive organization from our birth. We have harbored those enslaved people who determined they would be a part of revolution, and they would cut swaths through the people and land who were enslaving them. We've been a revolutionary organization from our inception. It is just recently when Black churches became more and more underneath the dizzying, death-dealing sway of white evangelicalism that we stopped being who we were. Harriet Tubman came from among us. Nat Turner came from among us. Malcolm X came from among us because his father, Earl Little, was a Black Baptist preacher and a Garveyite. All of these people were nourished by us. And Metropolitan AME Church, where I serve, I got connected with this group doing environmental work because we were part of a lawsuit suing Coca-Cola and the sugary sweetened beverage industry, which sells sugar beverages to us as if they're health beverages, which they are not. And so we then connected with them, and they were looking for Black churches who would amplify the fact that our people are dying as a result of heat. They're dying because they can't go outside, they can't exercise. And all of the social indicators of turmoil are enhanced in places that are hotter. So the church has always been on the front line of liberation, and this is just one of the many fronts of the fight.
Pastor Lamar, I got to leave it there, but I got to bring you back, though. If that's all right with you, we got to make sure we get a chance to bring you back and share a little bit more in this conversation because it's much needed. I think that people need to know what's happening with some people who's got some boots on the ground, but not just boots on the ground, but some real credible information. Thank you, my brother, for being with us.
Daren, thank you, brother. Y'all take care.
Hey, listen, all right.